So what we want to often with these changes, everything's interconnected. And one of the challenges you will face as business leaders, not just that technology is changing, not just that business models are changing, but people are changing. Your employees, your customers who are growing up in very different technology worlds where Larry said, virtual reality and reality are blending. One of the big challenges is how is that changing the human software we deal with as business leaders? To start getting at that, this is going to be a longer-term change, but my colleague, Henrik Bresman, professor of Organizational Behaviour and Leadership, the leader of INSEAD's Global Leadership Center, has started a research project around millennials. To what extent are they different? And in true INSEAD fashion, there's an important component of that, which is how does that change by region? Please join me in welcoming Henrik Bresman. Henrik, all yours.
Thank you. Thank you. Very, very kind introduction. I do think the mic is on. Very good. Very pleased to be here among all of you, dear board members, friends, colleagues, EMBA students, some of which are survivors of my teaching, I believe. That's quite impressive for those of you who don't know. So I'm very, very pleased to be here to share with you results from a study of the millennial generation. So what's the millennial generation? It's roughly the generation that was born between early 80s and late 90s, 18 to 30 years old. One way to think about them is the first generation that was truly mouse-trained before they were toilet-trained. And I will also specifically share some data about the millennials in the Middle East. So, why is this important? Why is this topic important? Well, we know that in about 10 years from now, millennials will constitute around 75% of the entire workforce in this world. And that means that not long from now, any leadership position of consequence in business, in government, in academia, in non-for-profit will be occupied by a millennial. So it's in all our interest that they succeed. It is in all our interest to understand something about what motivates them, what demotivates them, what makes them tick. And there are reasons to believe that the millennial generation is different from prior generations because of the massive changes brought about by globalization, because of the unbelievable information accessibility brought about by the internet. And we know this because a number of studies of this generation has already been conducted, which begs the question, why do another one? Well, the INSEAD Emerging Market Institute, the HEAD Foundation, it's a Singapore-based education think tank, and Universum, it's a global consulting firm, came together in a belief that while these existing studies are helpful, they're incomplete. They're incomplete because typically they are based on a very small sample, or they are based on a sample from a particular part of the world, which typically means the US or Western Europe. And we suspected that if we start to make decisions based on results from these data about how to attract, retain, and develop the leaders of the next generation, well, those decisions might be flawed because they are not comprehensive enough. And the result is this study that I'm pleased to share with you here today of the millennial generation, which is built on more than 16,000 respondents from 43 countries. And what emerged was results that were fine-grained. Some of the results from prior studies were upheld, some of them were not, but perhaps most interestingly, many of the results and what we thought we knew about the millennial generation depends deeply on the cultural context in which those millennials live. So what I'm going to do now for the next 15 minutes or so is that I'm going to do three things. First, I'm going to say a few more words about the motivation of the study and the data. And second, I will share a few samples of the results with you. And finally, I will share a few suggestions in terms of the implications. So that's where we are going. Now, just a few more words about what motivated the study. And having reviewed the existing literature on this, there are a few things that we think we know about millennials. We think we know about millennials that they would like to step into leadership positions. We think we know about millennials that they care more about work-life balance than about money and status. We think we know about millennials that they fear that they will never be able to retire like their parents. And we think we know about millennials that they rely heavily on friends and family for career advice. So, in terms of the objective of this study, we were, as previous research on this topic, we were interested generally to benchmark this generation, but there are two additional angles. We wanted to check whether these received notions, or what we believe to be true about millennials, is actually true. And second, we want to see if these findings may depend on the cultural context that we study. So that is where we are going. Now, I already mentioned something about the data, 16,000 respondents, 43 countries. I'm not going to dig further into that. I will just say that since, for the purpose of this presentation, we are particularly interested in the Middle East, about 500 of the respondents here are from the Middle East, including Abu Dhabi. So we don't have much time. Let us get straight back into to the results. First received notion about millennials, that they want to take on leadership positions. Is that true? Well, it turns out, generally, indeed, it is true. 69% globally, millennials, they are interested in taking on leadership positions. A little bit of variation there. Japanese millennials were a little bit less interested at 18%. Middle Eastern millennials, certainly quite interested at 76%. Now, one interesting additional question that we asked was this: why would they like to become leaders? And there were many different kinds of answers to that question. Some wanted to make more money. Some wanted to coach and develop people. Specifically about the Middle East, here's what we found. We found that the most common answer among Middle Eastern millennials was that they wanted to become leaders because they wanted to have the power to make decisions. They wanted to have the power to influence their own life, but also the lives of the organizations in which they work. And here, the Middle Eastern millennials stood out. That was the category which had the most responses, positive responses to that query about power to make decisions. The second most important one for Middle Eastern millennials was high future earnings, though it was actually a bit lower than for the rest of the world. There was one more thing, actually, that I wanted to say that is not on these slides that is quite interesting. We found that millennials generally, and also this was true for the Middle East, were interested in being specialists as opposed to generalists. Now, this may sound a little bit counterintuitive. Aren't leaders, by definition, generalists? Aren't leaders, after all, general managers? Well, start to make more sense when you also realize that millennials, they have a strong preference for working collaboratively. And so what emerges here is a view of leadership that is perhaps a little bit different from what we're used to, perhaps a little bit different from the top-down styles of leadership, the command and control style leaderships that we are used to. Because if you're a specialist leader, you need to rely on others. You need to work in a team. You need to be a distributive leader. And this is a finding that we are now digging into further to see what that actually means. Here is another question related to leadership, which is, millennials, what kind of leaders would they like to follow? And here the answers were all over the place. The most common answer globally was that they want to work for leaders who empower them. For Middle East, the most common answer was to be a role model, to have leaders to look up to learn from. Very importantly, though, they don't want to be micromanaged. That said, I don't know how many people actually would like to be micromanaged. They do not want to be micromanaged. So that's about leadership. Now let's turn to the second received notion, the one about work-life balance. It turns out that yes, on average, millennials around the world, they do weigh work-life balance more than money and status. But let's think about what work-life balance means. Many of us think about work-life balance as work-family balance. Well, here we found that millennials, by and large, they defined it slightly differently. The most common definition of work-life balance was to have leisure time to spend on private life. And that may involve family, but very often it also involves the individual millennial themselves. And this comes through quite clearly in the study. The millennials, they are quite individualistic. They want to have time for themselves. They want their employers to see them and work with them individually. Here is a related question, which is, so one important piece of work-life balance is the opportunity to learn and grow, to grow and learn in all parts of life. And they were given the question, well, what do you prefer? What's most important? To have a successful career or to grow and learn? And here, globally, grow and learn was in a majority. In the Middle East, it was split right down the middle. If you think that the animations on these slides are slightly random, I think it's because it's probably true. Now, here's a slightly more provocative question, perhaps, which is, what would you prefer? If you had to choose, if you were forced to choose, what would you choose? Would you choose a well-paid, prestigious job or a better work-life balance? Would you give up that job for better work-life balance? And majority globally said yes. For the Middle East, 49%, only 17% disagreed with that. And as you can tell, there are quite a few who are still thinking about what they think. Now, one important piece of work-life balance is, of course, the work part of the equation. And so we asked the question, what fears do you have as millennials about the work piece of this equation? And we found that in the Middle East, the most important fear that millennials have is to not get the match with their personality in their job. And this individualistic theme is coming back. And as you can see here, this is also the response that it's all over the world, it's true, but particularly so in the Middle East. And the second most important fear is to get stuck in a job where you don't have development opportunities, where your talents won't be developed, where your leadership skills won't be developed. The flip side of fears are hopes, aspirations. And we asked about what challenges, in a positive sense, millennials look for in a job. And the most important piece of this for millennials in the Middle East was working with talented colleagues who challenges them, followed by being involved in innovative work, which is positive if you believe the presentation we had earlier today by Miss Anderson is gone, I think. See, she's Swedish, I'm Swedish. That means that at one point, almost half the population of our country was represented in this room, and I think that probably made her a little bit uncomfortable. Let's see. So that's about that was about the challenges. Now, the third received notion that we wanted to look into was, do millennials, are they actually fearful of being retired? And here we found generally no. Now, Europeans are a little bit more pessimistic, and there could be good reason for that. But millennials in the Middle East, and particularly in Asia Pacific, they're actually quite optimistic about their chances to retire even before 6 years old. The final notion then that we wanted to test was the idea that millennials rely on their family and their friends for career advice. This we thought we knew was true. We actually found that that was not true on average. And even in the Middle East, which is one part of the world where millennials are most open to this notion, not a majority, only 44%. The only region of the world where the majority actually agreed to this idea, this notion that family and friends, they do give us good career advice. That was in Africa. Now, not telling the millennials what to do in terms of careers is different from not supporting them. Support me, but don't tell me what to do, seemed to be the bottom line in our findings here. All right, so those are just a few snippets. We have now a report ready for download for free. It's more than 200 pages, so I think you agree with me that was a good idea to just take a few snippets from that report. It is available to download for free. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the implications, but first let me just summarize some of the things that we found about millennials in the Middle East specifically, and even more specifically about the leadership aspect, because after all, that's what we do largely at INSEAD. It's a big part of what we do. First, millennials in the Middle East, they would like to become leaders, and the most important reason for that is that they would like to have the power to decide. They want to influence the future of their organizations and their countries. Second, they want to be specialists rather than generalists. So perhaps we see a new kind of leadership emerging here with the next generation. There's a little bit more collaborative, a little bit more team-based, a little bit more distributive. Finally, they would like to follow leaders who are role models to them, who they can look up to, who they can learn from. They do not like to be micromanaged, though. So those are some of the findings specifically for the Middle East. So what about the implications? Well, there are implications here, I think, for many stakeholders, but probably most obviously for any organization that would like to attract, employ, and develop the leaders of tomorrow. And one thing here that really jumps at me is that given how much work, how many of the professions are getting routinized, robotized, automized, a very important part of the success here is to focus on development, leadership development of this future generation of leaders. I read in The Economist just yesterday, it was a fascinating article about how even lawyers are now losing their jobs to software. I don't know if there are any lawyers here. Maybe you shouldn't read particularly this issue of The Economist. But anyway, the point being that what we need are leaders who can do all of that work that robots will never be able to do. Didn't we learn this morning that even yogurt is coming and taking decision-making power from us? So how do we do this? How do we do this? What does it mean to focus on leadership development for millennials? Well, the starting point is what we would like to refer to as a granular strategy, and that has two pieces. The first piece is to have an accurate understanding of how millennials differ across cultures. An accurate understanding of what constitutes normal attitudes, behaviors, and outlooks of millennials in different cultures. It doesn't make sense to treat Indian, Japanese, Swedish, Emirati millennials the same way. Now, in everyday life, we tend to know this, but somehow we tend to forget it when it comes to millennials. So if the first part of a granular strategy is to have a good understanding of what constitutes normal for millennials across cultures, the second part is to recognize that no one is normal in every way. It doesn't necessarily say anything about the individual millennial that you're working with. And if there's one thing that jumps off the pages of our report about millennials, it's this. Millennials would like to be treated as individuals. They would like to see an individualistic approach to their careers and to their leadership development. So let me end then with addressing this question highlighted in the title. How will millennials influence the future of the Middle East? And here's what I'd like to say. Having grown up with globalization and with the technological changes that came with the internet, millennials are more used to change and are more informed than any other generation before them. And this means that they have tremendous potential to lead and to influence the direction of the Middle East in a significant and positive way. But to do that, they need help from us, from the earlier generations. And that's why a disciplined focus on leadership development for these millennials, to help them take on these leadership roles all over society that we, by the way, depend on them to take on, well, that is a huge responsibility for us. And of course, it is a responsibility that we at INSEAD take very seriously. So that's what I'd like to leave you with. Thank you very much. Thank you.